Occupying the third space on the tactical wheel, compound or complex attacks are an important tool in fencing. Like all other actions, compound attacks have potentially low floors and high ceilings for implementation and outcomes, and I'd like to discuss them using some excellent examples from an event I recently attended. Here we have an example of a compound attack that is attack by feint. You see me feint and then cut around. Some details to note. My action starts from a wide measure, and I actually really only make two actions here during the relatively long tempo of my passing step, the initial feint and then my rechamber with the cut being delivered after the fact. Even though my opponent doesn't react to my feint, at this point I've committed to my action in such a way that when I see him not reacting, my only viable choice is to finish my action and accept that I'm probably about to take a disadvantageous double. My final attack doesn't form any sort of counter posture that would have protected me from the afterblow. I leave myself completely open to my opponent's attack. The success of my action here is predicated entirely on parry of the mind, right? Tricking my opponent into parrying themselves for me by biting on my initial feint. My opponent reads what I'm doing here, doesn't retreat or parry, chooses to go for the head, and I'm totally defenseless. I decided to try this action because my opponent and I know each other fairly well. They're familiar with one another's games, so I thought I'd try something unusual for me in hopes of surprising him. Unfortunately for me, he was fencing eyes open and responding to my behavior intelligently, not reacting to it automatically. That, combined with the mistakes I made of offering a long tempo, an insufficiently threatening feint, and overcommitting to my action, turned what could have been a clean point into a double. We're going to jump to pass 3 briefly to see an example of a compound attack that's functionally and tactically very similar, just executed better. My opponent starts by voiding my initial attack with his body and hands, and then as he recovers forward and brings his hands back into presence, he closes the line that my sword is threatening. He then starts a sort of feinted marching attack, shuffling his feet rapidly to make small adjustments in measure, in combination with several small, non-committal chambering actions. The combination of feinted footwork and feinted chambering actions give me lots of ever-changing information to intake and process without giving me any actual openings to bite on. This throws me for a loop, and I get locked into chasing the sword looking for the parry, allowing him to seize on the opening that I offer when he's ready. He forms a counter posture here, where I'm unable to hit him freely in that moment, forcing me to move my sword to attempt to parry his attack while chambering my own. He very briefly loses it during this window while he attacks, but it's replaced by me parrying myself through trying to respond to his actions. When his attack fully connects here, he's reformed the counter posture, leaving me unable to hit. He's never in danger of being hit once he commits to his final attack. It's really quite good. He takes every mistake I made 2 passes previously and demonstrates how they should be done correctly. Where I only made a couple of large slow actions, he makes a number of smaller, faster actions to much better results. And where I overcommitted to my action, he used a series of low commitment actions to apply pressure and make me act till he generated an opening to hit to safely. This is a good example of a compound attack that has a different form factor, thrust with disengage. Again, starting from wide measure, this time instead of a big chambering action to act as a feint, I attack by thrust to the inside, in a committed attack that will land if he doesn't address it. My opponent's cut would displace my thrust, so I disengage around the cut and finish my thrust to the outside. This time I do form a counter posture, and my opponent's sword ends up stuck in my crossguard, which is also in place to block any renewals to my upper openings. My opponent could still hit me, but rechambering to hit elsewhere would take long enough that I have time to respond accordingly. There are 3 key differences between this pass and pass 1. First, this time my initial action is a direct attack that will hit if not parried, forcing a response from my opponent who decides to commit to counterattacking. Second, my initial action, direct attack by thrust, is much harder to read and respond to effectively than big chambering action, buying me some additional time to act and wiggle room in how well I execute my subsequent actions. Third, I finish with a counter posture, protecting me from my opponent's action, kind of, but not really. I do end up getting a clean point here. I'll be talking more about this pass in a future video I make on competing, gamesmanship, judging, and rules. This next pass is what pass 1 could have looked like had I been a little bit more intelligent about my actions. There are some key contextual differences between my chambering action on this pass versus pass 1. First, we're starting a bit closer. Kieran is pushing and being a bit aggressive, and I think wasn't expecting me to advance, so I present much more of a threat here when I chamber my sword. After I make my move, I think he realizes that he's dropped his sword, leaving his upper openings exposed while I'm possibly in measure to hit. That draws a reaction from him where my chambering action in the first pass didn't because it started from farther away. Second, I don't immediately commit to an attack. I wait for him to react and see what he does before I respond in turn. In response, he brings his point up and retracts his hands slightly. This isn't a parry in and of itself, but will let him parry an attack to his head on the inside much faster if I do choose to attack there. However, in doing so, he opens up his upper outside line on the other side. He starts to push with his own chambering action in advance. However, his chambering action further opens up his outside line, and unlike in Pass 3, I don't chase the sword this time. I keep my blade free and remain responsive, not reactive to his actions. This combined with his advance bringing him into my narrow measure enables me to disengage and thrust directly to his head without needing to move my feet. He then attacks to my head with his Sver, but I'm able to offset his cut above my head as I retract my hands and repost with my own Sver to his hands, which he is unable to block. In making my initial attack a more valid threat by being closer and threatening an uncovered line, we can see how much more effective at generating clean hits Attack by Fate can be. Additionally, it's important that I didn't overcommit, allowing me to exploit an opening on the fly, and ensuring that I maintained some kind of defensive coverage to avoid being hit throughout the exchange. To recap, compound attacks are one of the fundamental tactical building blocks of fencing. Make sure that you choose an initial action that supports your goals and is appropriate to the opponent. Your opponent also gets a say in how things happen. If you aren't absolutely certain in how the exchange will go, fence eyes open and respond to their actions accordingly. Don't just execute some eyes closed macro action and react automatically. Finally, have an idea of your start, middle, and end states going in. How will you draw them to act, hit them in that tempo, and not get hit in return when all's said and done.